everybody, welcome to the Chess Harbor. My name is Raf and today I want to continue with the Philidor opening theory sections. Now I want to talk about the queenless middle game after bishop to g5. So last time we covered bishop to c4. Let's go over the opening moves. So white plays e4, we play d6, d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, knight to c3 to cover the e4 pawn, and now e5. Inviting white to make sure that we don't have castling rights, but giving us a very interesting middle game. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. After white exchanges the queens and now plays the move bishop to g5. So last week we covered positions with the move bishop to c4, immediately targeting the f7 square, where our response was bishop to c4. So I want to do a quick recap of that position. So a typical position would be something like this, where our king would be on the e7 square, our knight is going to go on to the c6 square, our pawn on e6 does an excellent job of covering the f5 and d5 squares, and we put a pawn on a5 on a6 to cover the b5 square. And we have tremendous activity on the half-open f-file. The d file is open for play. We can very easily shove our pawns on both the sides of the board, and play is generally easier for black, even though objectively the position is dead equal. So we're going to see that with bishop to g5 immediately the structure is actually a lot different, as our king can no longer hide on the e7 square, and our knight does not belong on the c6 square anymore. So we'll look at that in detail. So first of all, bishop to g5 does one thing, and that is threaten the check on d1 by castling, and that can give white tremendous initiative. So we want to play something that's not going to be possible, and I want to tell that immediately that we could play a move like bishop e6, and after castles we can just block it with our knight. It's entirely possible to play this way, but after a move like bishop, so let me show that actually different. So imagine I play bishop to b4 here, white castles. It's entirely possible for me to block with the knight, but after bishop to c4, for example, I have to play king back to e8, and my king is getting in the way of my rook's development, the knight is getting in the way of the bishop's development, and even though the engine claims this as theoretically equal, I would rather play white in this position because it feels a little bit tangled up inside of black's camp, let's say. So a very easy way for me to solve these issues is after bishop to g5, I like to move bishop to e6. We want to put our bishop on e6 anyway in the other line as well, so it's very easy to remember that here the bishop also belongs on the e6 square. After all, this diagonal is great for our bishop. White hasn't claimed it, why shouldn't we? Just like I said in the last video, bishop to g5 is a move that you can often ignore. The bishop threatening to take the knight is nothing to be worried about because we're just taking back with the g pawn. This strengthens our e5 pawn and gives us a g file to work with. So in general, I would say that bishop takes on f6, and you're going to see this in so many of your games, is actually a huge mistake, because it just helps us in general. So I like bishop to e6. Let's claim this diagonal, and it gives our king's shelter on c8. So after white castles now with check, our king can just go to c8. We could block with the knight, but it puts our knight in a pin. I'd rather put my king on c8 first, and we can play knight to d7 at a later stage. So here the white players usually they will follow up with knight to f3. I want to mention that the best move by white is the move f4 in this position, but it's only been played 17% of times, and most of these games are in 2000 or even 2200 ELO plus. It's usually only going to be seen at master level. It's the best move, and black has to be a little bit careful there. After the move f4, there is a couple of ways to play. You could immediately take the pawn, and that is the best way to play. But after a move e5, you're going to have to be careful. h6 is the best move by black, and you're going to get positions like this, where black's knight is going to be a bit loose. They're threatening this fork right now, and now the position is relatively equal. The engine even gives this position as slightly preferable for black. These have been the most played moves in play, and the move f4 gives white a lot of activity, but if you know what you're doing after this push, you should not really be worried. In fact, here the best move by white is to just play the move bishop takes on f4 and use the activity that creating that playing f4 gives. So knight to f3, bishop to c4, bishop to d3, or even bishop to b5. The bishop is very free, the rook has a free reign, and you're going to put rooks on the f file, rooks on the d file, and the reason that this position is good, is slightly better for white, is because of the activity. You got an open third rank, you got 2 open files to work with. It's nice play for white. So in general, black should not be extremely worried about this variation. Especially because you're not going to see this variation very often, but it is technically white's best try. So where were we? After this position, usually white is going to play a move like knight to f3, just pressurizing this point, and now we can play knight to d7. Notice that now the knight is no longer pinned, so that's why king to c8 is a really important move. And I want to show you that in 42% of games, white immediately goes wrong here and plays the move bishop to b5. Bishop to b5, you're going to see this in so many of your games, and it's just a straight up mistake, because you can simply play pawn to c6. You're going to kick the bishop away, and you want to put the pawn on c6 anyway. The pawn on c6 does 2 very important things. It covers the d5 and b5 squares. Notice that the big difference from the bishop to c4 variations is that we no longer have the pawn on e6. So this pawn on e6 is no longer there to cover these squares. So now the pawn on c7 on c6 does that job of covering these 2 squares, and it gives our king shelter on c7. Not only do we want to improve our king for later on, we want to clear the king of the back rank to connect our rooks. So pawn to c6 is going to happen in almost every game, and white has pretty much said here, please play it. So of course we are going to reply with that. And here 80% of games go bishop to a4. Bishop to e2 would not make matters different. Here bishop to b4 is already advantageous for black, so black already has a small advantage. I want to show you that here, yeah, you can really easily just refute anything that white plays and just already grab the initiative. So we're threatening to take the knight, double the pawns, and immediately win the e4 pawn. So rook h to e1, for example, we're still going to take the pawn, and we're going to win the a2 pawn. So these lines are very dangerous for white indeed, because now you're already just up a clean pawn. You're going to see this in so many games, that white is going to struggle with holding both the a2 pawn and the e4 pawn. So we're going to see that in one of the sample games as well, that it's really hard for white to hold their center together in this kind of variation. And bishop to b5 is just a terrible move, really. So in this structure, pawn to c6 is going to be played most often anyway, but let's say white doesn't blunder immediately and plays a move like bishop to e2. Usually we're going to play c6 anyway. We could also start with bishop to b4. The bishop usually belongs either on the c5 point where it points to f2, or on the b4 point where it can threaten to damage white structure. I personally prefer bishop to b4, as damaging the white structure is for me better than threatening the f2 point. Of course, white can always parry that with bishop to e3 or bishop to h4, for example, rook to f1. The bishop sometimes comes to the c5 diagonal. That's usually if we're invoked to do so. So a move that you're often going to see from white is again a mistake. They're going to play knight to d5, because currently the d5 square is not covered with a pawn yet. They're attacking our bishop, so now we drop back our bishop to another good diagonal. And after a move like this, let's say black or white plays a move like h3, we're going to kick away the knight, and they can take on f6, it doesn't matter, we're just going to take back with the g pawn. And now again they have problems with this pawn, so after bishop to h4 or bishop to d2, again they have problems with this pawn. In this case the pawn is not really a threat, because we have to be very careful with something like this. Here, this is getting very tricky. I would not advise on playing this. It is possible to save the bishop, but I wouldn't advise on doing so. In this position, it's better to just improve slowly. Moves like king to c7, maybe a5, and then later we can still look to take on this. Look later on to take on a2, but in a lot of lines this pawn is hanging. So with those ideas in your mind, let's go to the sample games, and we'll look at a couple of nice games here. So both of these games have been played in correspondence chess. We're about, I think I had 3 days for each move, my opponent as well. So the moves, the games took a long while to play, but my opponent still found ways to make quite obvious mistakes. So we have the normal opening moves: knight to c3, now e5, and the exchange of queens, and bishop to g5. As I said, bishop to e6, we want to clear the c8 square for our king. Knight to f3, a very normal move. We're going to want to cover our pawn here, and now castles by white. So it's not with check, but the pin on the knight should be resolved immediately, otherwise we're going to lose the e5 pawn. So king to c8, and now bishop takes on f6. As I mentioned in the bishop to c4 variations as well, you can pretty much ignore the bishop on g5. If they ever take back, you're just going to take back with the g pawn. If we would take back with the knight, of course our e5 pawn would hang. So we're always taking back with the g pawn, but the taking back with g pawn only strengthens our center and helps by giving us an open file. So my opponent played h3, which is not really doing anything. I played bishop to b4. A move like a3 would actually be a much better try, because at least it devoids our bishop of the good bishop b4 square. The knight can no longer be captured, and we have to play it on a square like c5, where it actually still does a very good job of harassing them, but at least the a pawn is not hanging, and threatening the doubling of the structure is not there. So after a move like rook to d2, just covering f2, the game would still be a lot more balanced. My opponent makes the mistake of putting the knight on d5, put the bishop on c5, and now rook to d2. I don't exactly know what this does, or I do know what this does. It covers the f2 square, but it doesn't address the issue of his pawn on a2 again. So I played a move c6. He has to move his knight, and now the a2 pawn hangs. And here it's a very delicate act of getting the bishop out. So white is going to try to prove that the bishop is hanging as a liability. But after b3, we have this bishop to a3 check. And notice the king, it cannot move forward to capture the bishop, so the king has to go backwards. And now a very important move is knight to c5. We're going to set up some kind of tactics on the b3 point. So knight to c5 is very important. It's also important because rook to d8 is going to be necessary in a lot of lines. So knight to c5, a very important move to keep in mind in these kind of lines where the bishop is going to take on a2. So bishop to d3, rook to d8, king to e2, bishop to b4, hitting the rook goes back, now a5. And here black is just completely winning already, because there's a lot of weak squares on the queen side, and this bishop is going to get out, and we've won a clean pawn, but I managed to screw up. So rook to a1, and I take with the bishop on b3. Notice that you cannot take back here, because then you can just take here and you're completely winning. You've taken back a pawn, you're taken back the bishop, and you're up 2 pawns. So this position is resignable for white already. So white doesn't take back. White plays rook h to b1. It's the best move. And now it's a very simple way to get the bishop out is bishop to a4. It's covered by the knight. At some point we're going to play pawn to b5. And then we can look to trade off the knight. We get our other bishop outside, and we have a very strong passed pawn on the a file, which is just going to straight up go for a home run and going to win us the game. But instead, even in the correspondence game, my opponent managed to make mistakes, but I make an even bigger mistake. And first off, I trade the knight with the idea that I can get my bishop out. But after he takes back, I immediately realize that it's a bad move, because if I move my bishop back to e6, for example, rook takes on b4 is going to net him a rook. So that is not an option. And then I started putting the question, where do I put the bishop instead? And for some reason, I played bishop to c2, completely overlooking the fact that the bishop hangs. Yeah. Not such a sharp idea for a correspondence game, of course. So my opponent, of course, takes the bishop, and suddenly we have a very interesting position where white is actually winning again. White has a better position, but the game is definitely not over. I have some compensation. I have two strong pawns which can run up the board. So white has an extra piece, but I have two pawns for it. And the pawns are both passed, and one is already advancing. And another added bonus is that white has a weak d pawn. He's going to try and solve this immediately, so I play bishop to e7 with the idea that I don't want any tactics here. And my opponent immediately tries to resolve his weak pawn. I don't want to resolve it, so I play bishop to d6 now, rook to a2. I take the pawn on d4 anyway now. Knight takes on d4, king to c7, g3, b5. So I want to get these pawns rolling, because it's my only way of still making something out of this game. Rook to c1, king to b6. So the good thing about this position is that my king supports these pawns. At the same time, if white manages to control these pawns, yeah, the game is just completely over, and my king could even become weak. Knight to f5, bishop to e5, knight c to e3, a4. So now I have a nice pawn chain, and I want to just look to push the pawns forward. So pawn to e7, knight to e7, rook d6, rook a to c2. So I'm under tremendous pressure here, and I just start pushing. So if white were to take on c6 here, it's not really going to be an issue here, because king to b7 and these two pawns, they are strong. The engine also believes that best white can do here is draw, because they're going to have to sack a piece to get these pawns in control. And here, so the position here after white is actually best idea for white is still to take here, but after rook takes, to take back with the knight, and after a move like rook to c8, knight to d5 check is actually the winning idea here, where the knights are going to be more active, and the knights can finally swap around to stop the pawns here. So that's the idea that white has to maybe win this game. But my opponent passively defends here. He plays rook to e2, and that's a mistake. Now rook to e6. The knight goes back to d5 with a check, and my opponent decides here to be trying to be practical, sack a knight for stopping the pawns, but it just doesn't work because my king has some shelter. Now the rooks can come in. After f4, I have a nice tactical shot with rook takes on e4. Let's see that if he takes the rook, I immediately win back the rook with bishop to b2 check. So that's a nice move. So my opponent plays king to f3, and after bishop to d6, f5, rook e5, rook d1, rook e1. He's kind of forced to trade a rook, to trade a pair of rooks, and in this position, these two pawns supported by the bishop, my king can still very easily support. The game is actually just over here, and White resigned in this position after rook to d3, rook takes on f5. My opponent resigned because I'm up 3 pawns. The pawns are supported by the bishop, and yeah, there is no hope here for white. Let's look at the second game. Starts with e4 again, d6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e5. The queens come off, and again bishop to g5. Bishop to e6, so we want to create some extra space for our king. Castles with check, king to c8, and knight to f3 again. And now we can play the knight from b to d7, h3, bishop to b4, bishop takes on f6, g takes on f6, and again we see this knight to d5 move, bishop to c5. The bishop is very happy to come to another strong diagonal, especially because white even traded their bishop here, so these dark squares, they're already much weaker than in the last game. a3 is not that bad of a move because at least there is no bishop takes on a2, but there's bishop takes on f2, so it's worse on another flank now. So c6, knight c6, so pushing the knight away, knight goes to b4. It doesn't really do anything else. On c3 it would not have been much better either, so I still have bishop takes on f2. As I mentioned, these dark squares are now extremely weak here. Yeah, it's, as I mentioned in the overview of the theory, white has a lot of issues holding the pawns. There is so much pressure on the center because the bishops are both going to be on good diagonals. That's very hard to hold the center together. So bishop takes on f2, bishop to e2, knight to c5. So now there is also pressure on the e4 point. Rook hits the bishop, but it actually doesn't help because I can defend my bishop by taking the pawn. Bishop to d3, check with the bishop, getting my bishop out. King to b1, and now rook, knight to g3 wins an exchange. The rook has no safe squares because if he goes here, I can trap the rook with bishop to f2. If he goes here, the knight can take it. If he goes here, the bishop can take it. So there is no safe square for the rook. So rook f2 e1, bishop to f2, and now rook to e2. So I can take it with the knight. Bishop takes, bishop back to b6, in g4, and now it's all about cleaning up. So I'm up 2 pawns and an exchange. It's a matter of technique now. I play king to c7, g5, e4, knight to d2, f5. So I want to get these 2 pawns rolling because they are passed pawns. They are going to win me the game. Knight to c4, I take that. Bishop takes on c4, and now a5. I'm looking to push back as many pieces as I can. So knight to a2, rook a8, and here my opponent plays rook e1. Let's see that this position is very dangerous. So of course the pawn is no good. It's a poison pawn here. Yeah, this just straight up wins the game. It's a very deadly combination. It's not much better if white tries to exchange the rook, because now rook to d1 is still a major threat. So for example here, it's exactly the same thing, so he cannot do that. And after a move like king to c1, yeah, of course I can also just exchange the pieces and start pushing the pawn. So here white is ready to be resigned, or white is ready to resign. So my opponent tried rook to e1, but I play bishop to f2, rook f1, e3, pushing my pawns, knight to c3, rook h to g8. I want to just clean up, so h4. Now bishop takes on f4, rook takes on f5, rook takes on g5, rook takes on f7 check. I can block that with a rook, rook to f8, rook to c5, and here a nice tactical shot, bishop to e6, and now I have rook takes on c3, with the idea that if he takes the rook, I can go here with check, so he can no longer do that. the rook is not threatening anything on c8 because I can always hide my king on the b6 square. So that's a nice tactical shot I take with the rook on c3. If he takes the other rook, which is what he played, I have the nice move e2 here, and this pawn is not going to be stopped. Not only does the bishop support the queening square, but the rook cannot block it. So if rook to e8, for example, yeah, of course I can just I would be able to just queen here, and after rook takes, we're just gonna win this end game. So here my opponent resigns. The move e2 was too much to bear. So a very nice showing of the bishop to g5 system, I think. Let me go back to this position. So in this position, the key points to remember is that bishop to b5 is a completely bad move. It's very easily met by c6, and then very often this a2 pawn is going to hang in a lot of lines. And also there is just too much pressure on the e4 point, even after white exchanges the f6 knight. The pressure on the g file together with knight coming to c5 on the e4 point is very strong, and bishop to b4 is always a good idea to harass the knight. After knight to d5, bishop back to c5, and the move c6 again is really key. So the big important move to remember is the move c6. Not only does it give space for our king, but it controls so many good squares that it's very important to remember this one. So that covers the bishop to g5 line. I think bishop to c4 is a much better try by white to play for an advantage, because playing against these two double pawns is much easier, much more intuitive than playing against this kind of setup. But bishop to g4, bishop to g5 is definitely the most played move by white. Yeah, you're gonna see this in about 50% of the games at least, with the idea that after castling, of course, white has some initiative, but it's a very nice and easy way to take the initiative out of white by playing bishop to e6 and hiding the king on the c8 square. So I hope you guys can play this in some of your games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next theory section.